Hello, folks. Rob Goller here. Thanks again for joining me for our weekly discussion of local history. And thanks again for the feedback. I know I say it every week, but it seems more and more people are sending me messages and stopping me out in the community to ask about history, which is what has always happened, but particularly what we talk about here on these live streams. So thanks for that. One little note, I do make mistakes. It seems like every week when I go back and listen to the live stream, I find something that I said that was either completely wrong or just even slightly misleading, because I don't have all my notes in front of me, and sometimes when I say something, I haven't checked it necessarily. So check the comments both here on Facebook and on YouTube. I try to make the corrections there. And if you think something's not right, let me know, because this is a back and forth discussion, and I'm not always right. I am human. So please keep that in mind. I do try to correct things um, when I say things that are incorrect in the spur of the moment when I'm here live and I'm don't necessarily have all my notes with me. It's kind of different to do this than writing. I've started out in writing, and it's even then you send something out and it gets published and there might be a mistake in it, but you have a lot more time to vet the information and footnote the information, and so this is a little different doing it this way. Thanks for last week's the comments about last week's topic, which was about Halloween and trick-or-treating. A few folks have asked me some questions about it, and we talked about how new trick-or-treating actually is. I actually had someone I was asking, an additional person who was around for Halloween's back before the 1950s, who said that they believed that they were trick-or-treating back here in East Aurora back during World War II. But then when we talked about it a little further, it didn't really sound like trick-or-treating. So the jury's still out, and if you want to hear more about the history of trick-or-treating in East Aurora and other places, check out last week's video, and let me know what you think. This week, the topic, a lot of times I get topic ideas from you all, and that's wonderful, and I still have a lot in the hopper, so if you've given me a topic idea and you haven't heard it yet, it's coming, or ones I can at least get to or know what I'm talking about. I'm not an expert in everything, and I'm not certainly an expert in everything in East Aurora or around United States history, global history. But I'll do it the best I can with some of the ideas that have been sent in to me. But this one comes out of this idea popped up as I was researching something else, and that's what generally happens. You're looking through old newspapers and old documents, and you discover something. You look to the left and you see an article in another column, and you go, "Ooh," and that's what happened here. And it's been on the back burner for a while, and I'm still doing a lot of research with it, and I will be writing about it, so stay tuned for that. But I wanted to talk about it today because we talk a lot about how history does repeat itself. And if it doesn't repeat itself, at least rhymes. So current events often rhyme with history, and we often can go back into history and find things that are really similar to current events. And this is one of them. So even today, and it's Tuesday, October 31st that I'm doing this video, and some of you might be watching it later. But we are seeing in the news, with the conflict happening in Israel and Palestine with Hamas and Hezbollah, that the incidence of anti-Semitism or anti-Palestinian hatred and bigotry and discrimination, and some of it goes beyond that, where it's actually people are getting killed and threatened here in America and in the United States and across the world. And what is happening is something that has happened throughout history, and we just can't seem to figure out how to change it when we should know better. Is changing or realizing that there is a difference between the people of a place and the government and the current government of a place. Um, so, for instance, the government of Israel and the government of Palestine and the people who are in charge of these terrorist groups, Hamas, in the Gaza Strip, um, and not separating those people, the geography and the government of the time right now, with the people who live there and the people who belong to that, who are descendants of or used to live there or are part of the culture that have moved either to the United States or elsewhere, have immigrated. Um, and you're seeing this. You'll see there was a case of the young boy who was murdered because he was a Palestinian American. Uh, and you're seeing anti-Semitism against American Jews and Jews across the world because of the conflict that's going on and the war in Israel and people's views of the of Israel and of the Israeli government's response to this and Israel's role in things that have happened over well since Israel was formed, and this conflict has been going on for decades. But not separating, we have trouble separating the current governments and the decisions being made by those governments and the conflicts and the people and the cultures. So you're seeing uh, actions being taken against people who have very little or absolutely nothing to do with what is going on over there right now, other than the fact that they're either descended from their ancestors come from that region, and their culture is of that region, either being Palestinian American or Israeli American or Jewish or Muslim. Just putting everybody in one big group rather than making those distinctions. That's current event. That's what's happening now. But this has happened in the past. And the reason this came up in my thought process today, particularly because we were talking about the anti-Semitism and the anti-Palestinian feelings that are happening, and in one case, a murder of a young boy, and that was in the news today. I've been researching in the newspaper article that came to mind for me, and how history is repeating itself in a slightly different way. But this newspaper article, I was looking through newspaper articles, the newspapers, for something completely different in June of 1918. And there was an article published in the East Aurora Advertiser on June 6, 1918. Now, I had heard that there were uh, calls back then, and not only that I heard it, I read about it, calls back during World War One to ban the German language in places. And what I'm trying to do here, and I apologize, I've kind of lost the article I was going to refer to, which is really important, so I don't want to lose it here. Here we go. And we always make the tendency to, we always tend to think that things like this are happening other places. And the anti-German American, especially, but German movement in the United States during World War One. And so this article kind of uh, surprised me on one hand, but I understood it on the other. And then I realized that things that were happening around the country and around the world were also happening here in East Aurora. So this article, June 6, 1918, on the front page of the East Aurora Advertiser, and the headline was Bar German Language. The East Aurora Board of Education in June of 1918 prohibited the teaching of German in the East Aurora schools for no other reason than we were at war with Germany at that point. And this was a rather big deal, but they said that the reason and the East Aurora Advertiser actually went through all the whereases of their resolution, and the reason was because they believed that the students would be better off learning other things. Why waste your time on the German language when you should be learning other things? They said, whereas we as a body, the East Aurora Board of Education, desire to emphasize our belief in things that are all American, and whereas we at all times desire to see instilled into the minds of our boys and girls those things which are truly patriotic. Is this sounding familiar? To some of you, it might sound familiar. Whereas we desire most emphatically to renounce the necessity of the existence in our school or our community of the alleged culture of that people or country which seeks to dominate this world, the Germans. So the school board is renouncing not only the language but the culture of Germany. Um, and so they decided after that school year, German would no longer be taught. This was a big deal, not only because the students they had to actually find a way around because students were getting credit for these classes, so they had to take a foreign language. So they were given credit for the classes they already took, but they had to go take another foreign language, and so they had to jump from one foreign language to another. Um, but also, this had implications for the community, and it was kind of surprising to me because we had here in East Aurora and in a lot of communities like ours, a very large German American population, German immigrants who came to our community in the late 1800s, early 1900s, um, and made it their home. And so this this statement kind of went against a lot of the people here and their experience because the language itself is not being against Germany and the current government there is one thing during World War I, but to broadly say that the German culture and German language was something that we didn't want to have around anymore, basically banning it. Um, that sent a huge message. And what was really striking is here in East Aurora and in Porterville, the communities around us, Elma, Griffin's Mills, we had a large German population, so much so that we had the Lutheran Church was founded by German immigrants, and they actually referred to it as the German Lutheran Church. And they would have services in both German and English as these families tried to assimilate. So World War I comes along, and you have resolutions like this. So some of the language was one part of it, but also the cultural parts of it. There were actually communities in the United States that were going as far as changing the names of streets and buildings from German-sounding names. So Berlin Street, they would change it and Americanize the names. Um, and it sort of reminded me of when we stopped calling French fries and named them freedom fries for a while. But um, but that was interesting to me um, because you had a German American population that was fairly large in our communities, and this is what the school board was saying. Now, they the newspaper right after we declared war in the spring of 1917, the East Aurora Advertiser actually wrote this editorial, or they reprinted this editorial from another newspaper that tried to make that distinction, basically saying the Germans that are here, the German Americans that are here, are really struggling because they have family over in Germany, and we're at war with them. They left for reasons, and so they are loyal to the United States, and a lot of them just didn't like the war. But to come out and say that would have consequences. So there were actually communities that were trying to ban German language being spoken in public and at church services. So the Lutheran Church actually continued having German services in German and English throughout the war and after. So they continued that. But one of the things I noticed, so this whole resolution of the school board was very symbolic, and indicative of other things that were going on. And one of the things I did notice is that just before the war, the newspaper used to refer to the church as the German Lutheran Church. Now, that wasn't the official name of it, but they would call it the German Lutheran Church, and there would be things listed, events and activities and services underneath. As World War I was happening over in Europe, we weren't involved yet, but it seems to, and this is just anecdotal at the moment, is they were dropping the German. So the headline would just be the Lutheran Church, and they would have English and German language services, so that German wouldn't be in the headline. Before the war, quite interesting, the Easter Advertiser was running all sorts of articles about praising Germany, how their educational system was better, how their literacy rate was much better. And then as we got involved in the war, a complete opposite. There was a lot of propaganda. They actually had a weekly column talking about why Germany was bad, how their system was bad, and things had changed. But there was one article that was quite revealing where they talked about how Germany has always had a tendency toward war and always had a tendency toward doing bad things, treating people poorly, and war crimes, essentially. But just a couple years earlier, they were praising these syndicated articles that were printed in the local newspapers across the country, including our own, were just a few years earlier praising the German system. So you can see how that changed. Well, imagine you're a German immigrant here, and you're an American citizen who's trying to assimilate into this community, and they had the German Lutheran Church. And this is, I have a personal connection to this. My great grandparents came from Germany, and they didn't speak English very well. And they went to a German services. They lived out in Porterville. And so I try to picture, it's not just people from the past in newspaper articles. There are actual people that I know. I know what they looked like. They're my great grandparents, and a lot of us have that. And so this part of our history is personal, our personal stories. So there were movements to ban German things just because they were from Germany, and it had nothing to do with the current government. It was German culture that was brought over, but it was German culture that preceded all this, preceded the government of the World War I era. So we were losing that culture. The language was being banned in the schools, which to me didn't seem practical. It seems that if we were at war with a country, that we would want to encourage our students to learn the language. So, and at that point, they didn't know how long this war was going to go on. But it would seem important for us to learn the language of the adversary, and that would help us in the war effort. That's just me, but it seemed like that was counterproductive. And this was a rather big deal because French and German were the languages that were being taught elementary school up through high school at that point in time. So they were taking away a major language. Today we don't see it maybe as a major language in our schools and to learn, but back then it was a major language. So they didn't go as far as banning German in churches, but places like Australia did. And there are places, if you just do a little research, there are places around the country that attempted to do that, to prevent not only the teaching of German, but the speaking of German in public and in churches. Not even out on the streets in public or in shops or anything, but in church services. German schools were popular back then for German immigrants, and they were told in many places that it was banned to teach German. So even in German schools, they couldn't learn the German language in addition to English. So they were learning two languages, and they were to assimilate and also trying to keep the German language as well, and that was banned. An interesting tidbit that I noticed in the papers was that in addition to dropping the German off of many things that had labels, before the war, you had a lot of organizations that for German Americans. We had social clubs in East Aurora. We actually had a group of German Americans that had officers, and they met down at one of the fire halls here in East Aurora. We had the German Singing Society. Um, and I noticed that in the paper before the war, before about 1916, every week there'd be something in the paper. A German Singing Society, German American group was meeting. And then during the war, those groups may have still been meeting, but they didn't publicize as much. So this did have an impact. One of the other things was that during the war, if you were an organization, you came out and made a point of um, of showing your loyalty, or not taking sides one way or the other. And one of those was the Roycroft had a German band, and they played German music, and they had German dressed in traditional German uniforms. And they actually had a picture in one of the magazines, and underneath it said the Roycroft German Band, "We are neutral!" Exclamation point. And so anecdotally, I don't know. I wish we had some diaries and things from people. My great grandmother, I'd love to have her diary to see what was happening. Um, but with all this going on, there was no doubt that German immigrants were being treated poorly and discriminated against for something that was happening overseas by a government that many of them had left. And were so imagine in here in the United States during World War I and World War II, foreign non-citizens were required to register with the post office or with the government. Um, and imagine you're walking around with a German accent, having come from Germany, but you're a citizen, and people are just lumping you in. Did you register? That was being said to people. They don't have that in the newspaper as far as I can find, but there is no doubt in my mind that was happening here in East Aurora just because of what they were doing. The school board was banning the language in the school, and there were the German band at the German American band at the Roycroft was coming out making a statement that they were neutral in the war. Um, so there's no doubt in my mind they were getting negative um, discrimination against them during the war simply because they were of German descent. So, of course, this happened again during World War II. We didn't learn that against the Japanese, too. We had Japanese American citizens of the United States. They were interred in camps during that war because of the fear that they had some sort of connection with the Japanese government during World War II, even though they were citizens of the United States. And the same thing was happening to the Germans during World War I and World War II. But again, it's this idea that we think when we hear these things in the news or we hear these things in the history books, we think that it was somewhere else, that it wasn't in our community. But actually, this case, it probably was, we were probably part of it more than a lot of places because of our very large German immigrant population. We had German American organizations. And the fact that it's documented in the paper, we know that this was happening here. It wasn't happening in New York City or other places when we read about it in the history books. So when we hear about this, the discrimination against Germans and German Americans in World War One, remember it was happening right here in East Aurora. And the context of it, we still just don't seem to have figured out that that what's happening, the governments and the regimes of these countries and the wars that are happening, we're lumping people into cultural groups and taking, even if it's mentally and how we think, uh, we're lumping groups in unfairly, and we've been doing it uh, with conflicts, with wars, for a very long time. So what's happening today, unfortunately, isn't new. But what bothers me a little is we haven't learned our lesson, and that tends to happen with history on the local level and also national and international level. Is we they always say we study history so we don't repeat it, but we often repeat it, and that's a lot of what historians do is point out the repetitive mistakes that we're making over and over again, which we should be fixing and not doing, and we should be learning from history. So, again, stay tuned because I will be writing about this probably sooner than later. Because I didn't imagine that this would be coming up in the news so much. And again, that rhyming history of what was happening over 100 years ago and what's happening today. And so I'll probably be writing about it sooner than later. Again, thanks for joining in. I'm Rob Goller, the town and village historian, but that's what I happen to be. But these videos and a lot of my research are done separately, so anything I say here does not reflect my official position as town and village historian. Keep the comments coming. Thanks for joining in, and again, thanks for keeping history alive. Thanks for joining me.